This conference will now be recorded.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today to discuss budgeting and teacher training for technology. My name is Wilmarie Newton, and I will be moderating this call. I ask that you please mute yourself in order to avoid background noise while the presenters are speaking. However, you can unmute yourself if you would like to ask a question, or you can type it into the chat box. If you are calling in from your cell phone, please take a moment to physically mute your cell phone, as I am unable to mute you from my computer unless I mute all participants and will not be able to unmute you after. Just as a reminder, this meeting is being recorded and will be archived on CABE's website under Services. Now I'd like to turn it over to Nick Caruso.
Good afternoon. I can say that now. Good afternoon. This should be, I think it promises to be a very informative session. Might as well first introduce myself, Nick Caruso, Senior Staff Associate for Field Service and Coordinator of Technology at CABE. And I also serve as a member of the Connecticut Commission for Educational Technology and chair the Digital Learning Advisory Council for that commission. We're joined by a couple people very important to that organization. And just as a quick aside, you know, up until a couple months ago, educational technology was something we did, but there was little statewide initiative for distance learning in particular. In fact, there was quite a bit of resistance, I would say, as we looked at, you know, trying to move it even in baby steps as we were doing over the last few years. Well, now we're in the middle of it, and that's what we're doing. And it's going to present a lot of challenges. It has already presented a lot of challenges. It's going to continue to present a lot of challenges. And we could probably go all day and talk on a variety of topics, but we've decided to start with a couple, and starting with budgeting and teacher training. We're going to be joined today by Doug Casey, who is Executive Director for the Connecticut Commission for Educational Technology, and serves us well in that capacity. He also participates in a lot of national and state organizations dealing with educational technology. He's a guru when it comes to a lot of this stuff. And Chip Dumais, who is the Executive Director for C.E.S, also chairs the CAPS Technology Subcommittee and is also a member of the Commission for Educational Technology. And he has brought with him Jacqueline Whiting, and he can introduce her. But I guess we'll start with Doug, and let's get going.
Thanks so much, Nick. Good afternoon, everybody. And I want to echo Nick's introductory comments. I'm so grateful for him and for Chip and for Jackie. This is a really pivotal moment, chapter in our educational experiences as we shift to online learning. I think it's a safe bet to say that we will never go back to the way things used to be. There will be some modified version of the new normal, but education technology has huge potential to support learning as we're seeing now, with all of its bumps and bruises. So I'm going to focus on one aspect, which is looking at technology budgeting. And I've got some data to share on a recently completed statewide survey, as well as providing some guidance to you, both in terms of supporting digital learning, distance learning now, as well as when kids come back in whatever phased approach that we're adopting locally, to provide some guidance for you. So I want to start off with a little bit of context before we jump into the recommendations. So first of all, the commission does have some good resources that we put together and curated on our webpage. I won't go through all of these right now, but we have really tried to focus on everything from strategy down to tactics, how to connect students at home to the internet, set them up with the devices. And so again, great resources there. ct.gov/edtech will get you to that page. And you can also follow us on Twitter using the hashtag KeepCTLearning, and our handle is just CTEdTech. A little bit of good news before we jump into what you're going to be potentially paying for, in addition to your normal budgets. But as a quick snapshot here, I think most education leaders are aware that there is federal money coming. The two funds that are most recent come out of the CARES Act. So the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund, which is split between higher education and K-12. And then the fund that is probably most directly going to impact school districts, which is the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund. In really quick, direct translation of these big numbers, what you can expect from this allocation, the second one on the right, the Elementary and Secondary Fund, is about 80% of your Title I funding will be coming to you. So you're almost doubling your Title I funding. From a timing perspective, I'm not sure when that money will flow, but it probably will be coming in sometime in either late this month or early June. But I am not responsible for managing and distribute those funds. But it's just to put that on your radar that those funds will be coming in, and they will be available to support the continuation of educational services, which could include education technology. So keep that in mind. I mentioned a statewide education technology survey that we just completed, and I'm actually in the process of tabulating and putting into a formal report, but I want to share some of the sort of a preview of some of the data points. The screen that I'm sharing right now shows a lot of information that to sort of guide you through understanding what this is we receive responses from about 110 of the 169 school districts, so a really good response. We have input from curriculum directors, people in charge of teaching and learning, as well as technology directors, people who really understand digital learning and are responsible for it. And across a number of different categories, we saw commitments to or already purchased investments in different categories. So from student devices and staff devices all the way across to cellular hotspots, what people are calling MiFis. So these little hockey puck shaped devices that you can give to students, and they turn them on, they can get onto the internet through their computers. In addition to that, software, technology, staff, and finally professional development. And I look at this, and it's what I find interesting is that the red is commitments. Absolutely, these districts are going to be moving forward these kinds of investments. The maybes you can interpret, the no's are flat out no, they're not going to be purchasing or investing in these areas. What I find really interesting is there's a lot of red, there's a lot of commitment to buy more devices, more software, spend time at least, if not dollars, in professional development. Little concerned about the very low commitment in terms of technology staff. So I would encourage you as district leaders to be thinking about if there's one thing you take away from this overview, it's to engage your current technology leaders and engage with them, or make sure there is engagement and planning around what these new needs will look like. Because to sort of assume that the deluge of new ed tech coming into your four walls when school reconvenes, to do that without having any additional supports may well be a challenge. So getting to sort of the budget checklist, areas that you might want to discuss with your technology leaders and your heads of teaching and learning. I would quickly go through some of these areas. Obviously, student devices is a big one. Many school districts are already one-to-one at various levels from pre-K all the way up to high school. Staff devices could be another area where there is a need for investment. Many school districts already have teachers just get a laptop when they join the district, but many don't, and that means that they may not be able to get online at home or have a device to get online at home. The professional development is kind of obvious. We see, I would say, if there is next to getting students online and getting them a device that they can use, the next biggest concern that I've heard from the field is professional development, that teachers, and it's no criticism of anybody, but teachers just were not prepared to be teaching online or in an online offline blended approach, and so providing teacher supports for that new reality is key. And regardless of whether we sort of phase back in or come back all at once, the need for continued professional development around education technology is key. And I'll leave it at that. Chip and Jackie will dive into that in a few minutes. I mentioned additional staff already. Again, to be thinking about how does technology use and volume scale with the need for supports from staff, whether it's full-time equivalents or potentially engaging with vendors, providers. New software is another big concern. So another trend that we've seen is many educational technology companies giving away software. A great example is Zoom. We saw an explosion of Zoom when we went into the shift to remote learning. That a lot of districts were adopting it. We had individual teachers setting up accounts because they were free, and a lot of other companies are doing this. They'll give you 3 months free, and so be aware of the level of new software that's being used, and the potential for a lot of new charges once all those limited time free accounts come due, and you'll have to start paying for licenses. That could be significant. The last point I want to talk about is managing new device types, and I want to share the next data slide with you. So again, this is from our statewide survey, and the devices that are being used now, so current device types, we see from the early elementary and elementary grades, we see some Chromebooks and probably the most densely populated use of iPads right at the early elementary stages, because at those levels, we're looking to give kids a simple device, easy to use, not necessarily really mature keyboarding skills. By the time you get to middle school and high school, we're looking at almost all Chromebooks. And I'm sharing this because I want to sort of acknowledge the wonderful gift that the Partnership for Connecticut through the Dalio Foundation is giving away 60,000 laptops to the Alliance districts, and that's great. But I think if you're in one of those Alliance districts and you've got these computers coming in, there will be some planning required to support these computers because they are Windows computers. They're not Chromebooks, which if you look at the densely populated red here, Connecticut, like most states, is a heavily Chromebook Google state. So when you introduce new technology in the form of these Windows machines, your technology directors and your technicians and even your teachers are going to have to learn some different ways of managing these devices. So they will bring different challenges, which will require time and effort, and they may require additional charges, which I'll get into in a moment. So as we look at the budget checklist, beyond the other items that I talked about from professional development and devices, think about and this is important, think about increased bandwidth allocations. The Connecticut Education Network, which the Commission for Education Technology oversees and governs, sees an increase of about 50% in internet bandwidth usage every single year. And those are under normal terms. So now imagine this explosion in devices that are being deployed, right? So the one gift from the Dalio Foundation was 60,000 new laptops across the state. My guess is we're probably looking at 100,000 new devices across all of our school districts that will be coming back into schools whenever we reconvene. At some point, all those devices will be in the four walls of Connecticut schools. And so thinking about the increased allocations of bandwidth that will be required, you also need to be thinking about wireless networks. So within the school, you not only need a connection to the school, but you also need to be thinking about the wireless networks. So how do you ensure that every student and staff member with their new devices, that they can all get online and take assessments and collaborate and explore and do the kind of research that they can take advantage of with these new devices. Obviously, firewalls and cybersecurity are a key concern as well. Firewalls think of these as gatekeepers, where you're trying to prevent the bad actors from getting into your network and trying to prevent people from clicking through onto things like malware and phishing schemes. So, firewalls and other sort of cybersecurity software and appliances can really help protect your network. But if you're bringing a lot of new devices in, higher volume, then you're going to need to be thinking about, well, is our firewall, 10 years old? It was on its last legs before this happened, and now it's not going to be able to sort of keep up with that volume of traffic flowing through to make sure it's all safe. So, again, think about, as you engage with your technology leaders, how's our cybersecurity doing? Do we need to think about assessing what those provisions look like? And then finally, looking at cellular hotspots. And so these MiFi devices that have been deployed, many of them were given out for free. But again, that bill will come due. And if you're looking at, taking on the wonderful challenge of making sure that every student is connected outside of school, thinking about budgeting for that cost down the road. The Commission is developing something of a matrix among our Digital Learning Advisory Council and our Infrastructure Advisory Council. We've got some really, really bright people. We're going to sort of collect their knowledge and develop something of a matrix so that the district leaders will have the ability to look at the different providers, Sprint, T-Mobile, Verizon, AT&T, the list goes on and on. What exactly does each program offer? How much does it cost? How much data do you get? Does it include things like filtering? Those kinds of concerns, so that you can make a sort of apples to apples decision about what kind of hotspots you want to purchase and give to students. So I would be thinking about all of these concerns. Sort of some action items, as I mentioned earlier, is again, discuss technology needs, current and planned, with your instructional and technology leads. These are the folks who are experiencing digital learning on the front lines. They see where the issues are. They will know where there may be potential gaps as students come back with devices, and so engage them on those fronts. The next recommendation is, contact your provider, which everybody in Connecticut, every school district in Connecticut is a C.E.N customer that provides your core internet service to you. So taking a look at what is your current bandwidth consumption and doing some calculations as to, if we bring in 30% new, 30% additional devices, what's that going to do likely to our bandwidth usage? We've also trained students and teachers to be using a lot of educational software during this time of remote learning. If that trend continues when students come back in, you're going to see not only a sort of volume as a result of new devices, but also more usage. So the CN team is prepared to have those conversations. We're already having them with a lot of districts. So, we would encourage you to sort of take those steps. CN also has some phenomenal solutions around filtering and device level protections around cybersecurity that can really help with that transition of new devices in, especially those Windows devices I mentioned earlier that Alliance districts are getting. Again, those are wonderful gifts, but if you're looking at the renewal costs for all the software that's being delivered on top of those new Windows laptops, those could run into pretty significant costs. One district told me that they were looking at, once they got their new laptops, next year they will have a new bill for something they haven't been paying for, which is filtering. That new bill will be $40,000. So start planning for that early. Have those discussions about these great new devices and how you can sort of minimize the cost of maintaining them while taking advantage of those great gifts. And then the final recommendation that I would give to you is, as you're looking at new software usage, I would encourage you to take a look at that link, the Learn Platform link at the bottom of the slide here. In a quick summary, what that link will do is give you information about how you can collect actual software usage data from your student devices. It's anonymized, so you don't have to worry about privacy issues. But what that does is it gives you a gauge of the software that's being used, so that if you are planning to continue using new software titles, the example that I gave is Zoom, that you'll have a sense of what's really being used in the field and budgeting for those software titles, or making a decision that this was useful during the time, but we can't afford to renew it. But I think the caution is no one wants to get slapped with a bill, with an invoice at the end of these trials, the free software trials, when every student and every teacher has been conditioned to using them every single day. So try to plan ahead for that. And with that, I just want to leave you with my contact information. If you have any questions about what I've shared today, I'd be happy to make any clarifications or recommendations. And with that, I will pass things over to Chip and Jackie, or maybe Will Marie, if you're the master of the meeting. Maybe you can do that.
Yep, I just made Chip the presenter.
There we go.
Yeah, and Chip, before you start, we can do questions and answers after Chip is through. So save your questions for Doug. I think you have to unmute, Chip.
The disadvantage of being polite for the rest of the presentation, right? So thank you very much, everybody. Nick, thanks for having us. Nick and Doug, thanks for your work on the commission. So I am the executive director at Cooperative Educational Services, one of 6 Connecticut RESCs, serving the majority of Fairfield County. And I brought with me Jackie Whiting. Jackie is an experienced Connecticut teacher who is also a published author on a lot of the topics we're going to talk today. She was hired here at C.E.S. to be an innovation and technology specialist, understanding that there's more than the equipment, and there needs to be good instruction and design behind the work that teachers do. So while it says innovation and technology specialist, it was difficult to come up with the title because it's 100 more things than that. So I'm going to start off with some of the higher level items that have come out of this recent school closure and some realizations that we've had. some work of the CAPS Technology Committee, as well as the RESCs and educators in general. So here's, of course, as everybody understands, one of the biggest issues that we have to overcome is that even with 169 towns, Connecticut has 206 districts, 6 RESCs, a Department of Education that unfortunately, great people, but fewer and fewer of them as we move along. Lots of supporting organizations between CABE and CAS and CAPS. Lots of people doing parallel work. So prior to this, the state of Connecticut has a number of resources supported by CET. And I'm not going to list all of them, but I'll give an example, whether it be open educational resources or other resources that are openly available to districts. I think what we're finding right now is that whether it's plans for returning to school or plans for distance learning, we need to do a better job of curating those resources and sharing those resources. There are a number of places where they're currently being collected, and you can find a lot of them and they repeat. As a state, we have the mechanism to go ahead and share these on a broader level, and a lot of the work is being independently done. This is an opportunity, whether it be districts or RESCs, and I think I would point more towards the RESCs to help support the work of the Department of Education. Districts are looking for guidance on a whole number of issues, and when it comes to higher level policy issues, that should certainly be the work of the Department of Education. When it comes to curating resources and sharing, there are other mechanisms in the state that I would encourage the boards to work with their superintendents to work collaboratively with other districts. There are currently existing resources and structures that exist, and it's very difficult with the independent nature of school districts in Connecticut to get people to do this universally. But I do think that every step that we take towards doing this more frequently will help us in the next pandemic situation, where we demonstrate a commitment to collaboration in doing the work and the necessity to be agile. I do understand it's very difficult at the board level for districts to be agile, especially when there's a budget process that takes 18 months before you actually spend the money. And I do think that there are organizations, whether it's the commission or RESCs or others in the state, or the committees at CAPS, or through any of these professional organizations. So we need to find where the agility exists and allow those people to demonstrate that agility. And lastly, the one thing that we've learned in this process, so Doug was talking about the increased use of educational software. And this is a great transition from me to Jackie, who's going to get into some specifics that districts can do to help teachers develop these skills. A contractor friend of mine used to share with me that there are 3 things, and you can have any 2 of them: speed, quality, and cost. And you get to pick whichever 2 you want. If you want it to be fast and high quality, it's going to have a huge cost. If you want to have low cost and high quality, it's going to take a long time. I think we're in a situation right now where we've asked educators to do really fast work at a really low cost. And that means that one of the pieces that we're compromising that quality aspect. And that is not a criticism of anybody involved. It is simply what happens in the process. People are asked to do things quickly with software or equipment that they may not have used in the past. And so they're working hard to find effective ways to do it. They may not be the best ways. And so I put this out as a caution. Just because people are using Zoom or Google Meets or other remote access software right now, doesn't mean that if we had to use it again in the fall, that we would consider everybody experts. And I think that that is a great transition from this part to getting into what the quality aspects of this type of work are with Jackie.
Awesome, thanks. So I'm just going to say click, Chip, and you'll just keep clicking, okay?
You got it.
All right, thank you. Thank you, everybody. One of the things that I want people to take away is that a lot has changed, and as Chip said, a lot has changed incredibly quickly, and there's been a Herculean effort to triage people as we've been moving through this change. But Chip, if you can start to click now, there is something that really hasn't changed, and that's what good teaching and deep learning look like. So go ahead, Chip. So the first thing is that good teaching and learning, whether it's in person or whether it's done in a distance or a remote fashion, begins with engagement of students. And teachers have kind of a tool case for how they're going to do this when they're working with students in a classroom. But when they've moved into a remote setting, they've had to find new ways to do that, particularly ways that they can engage students' interest in a coming unit or a lesson where they aren't actually there to monitor whether or not their engagement has been successful. So it's not just a matter of a bell or a whistle that's going to hook the student's interest, but have I actually hooked them into the content that I want them to be exploring? That's always been important. It continues to be important.
I'm going to click, Jackie, but you've reminded me of the one comment that I'll make that'll interrupt your section of the presentation.
Go ahead.
I think that if you were to ask teachers right now, or if you were to ask teachers 6 months ago, I think many would have thought that incorporating technology into their lessons would raise or ensure a level of engagement. And I think they're realizing now that the technology is not supporting the engagement. Great instruction is supporting the engagement.
Thank you. So following engagement, we need to still provide students opportunities for authentic exploration of what we're talking about. Whether it's remote or in person in a classroom, students still need some ownership of what it is they're going to be learning, and they need to be able to follow the paths of their own curiosity. All good teaching and learning includes direct instruction by teachers. So if prior to the school shutdowns, people had been having conversations about whether or not teachers were going to become superfluous or unnecessary, I think we've proven to everyone that teachers are more necessary than ever. Direct instruction, direct explanation by the teachers to the students, whether that is in large group, in small group, or in one-on-one settings, is still essential. The key is to provide all of those mechanisms for differentiation and personalization when it comes to the teacher providing that instruction. Students still have to apply the learning. If they only get up through direct instruction and there is no opportunity to take all of that learning of content and that practice of skills and actually use it in an authentic context, then the value for them of that learning falls short. The depth of that learning is then pretty shallow, and the permanence of that learning erodes really quickly. Finally, one of the really cool benefits of the way in which people are learning now and tapping into the platforms that Doug was referencing is that teachers are discovering more and more opportunities for students to actually share what they're learning and to expand the audience with whom they are sharing. So it's no longer a student producing and a teacher consuming, or a student doing an assignment and a teacher as the only audience, but we've really expanded those audiences and allowed students to engage in a wider audience, which then encourages for them deeper reflection on what they've been doing, why they've been doing it in that way, obstacles they encountered, how they got past those obstacles, learning areas that still remain for them. That sharing with an authentic audience is really key to prompting that meaningful reflection. And then finally, we've always offered students opportunities for enrichment. If a student is maxing out what you're doing with them, what a teacher is doing with them in a classroom, the teacher always offers that enrichment, that extension, that opportunity to do more, to practice more, to apply in yet another or a new way. All of this was true before the shutdown. All of this continues to be true during the shutdown. All of this will continue to be true, whatever the next phase of school looks like after the shutdown. So if that's what stayed the same, here's what changed. The first thing that changed is that teachers had to very rapidly develop some level of preparedness for doing everything I just said remotely. And for many of them, that's where the skill set was lacking. And so the work that we've been doing at the RESCs, the work I've been doing at PDS has been to help teachers ramp up on that part of their skill set. And now that they're developing those skills, it's helping them to step back and now take a wider look at unit and lesson implementation. So the other thing that had to change was how we understood all of our curricular mandates and all of our curricular constraints. When educators get together and write curriculum, there is always, or has been up until this point, this embedded assumption that the teacher and the student would be face-to-face in the classroom when that curriculum was being implemented. And when that is no longer true, then teachers really are pressed to rethink how they meet the constraints of their curriculum. If people weren't paying attention to issues of equity before the shutdown, certainly the shutdown has put it in the front of lots of people's minds. So whether it's teacher access to device, student access to device, family access to device, or to connectivity, or to different platforms where some schools can afford site licenses and other schools can't, the equitability of how teaching and learning happens is a new challenge. And finally, families have just been slammed left, right, and center. Educators working from home, non-educators working from home, balancing their work needs with their students' school needs, with their access to devices or lack of access to devices, and add on to that, everybody's need for a little rest, because if there's one thing that I hear a lot of people saying, it's I work harder and longer hours now than I did when I was face-to-face with people in a brick and mortar office. And then on top of that, we layer everybody's emotional wellness, and not just the emotional wellness caused by change, and not just the emotional or the lack of emotional wellness, the challenge caused by the change, the challenge caused by balancing the family needs, the challenge caused by people's own anxiety and fear of what has caused all of this in the first place. So there's so many layers to that. So we know it didn't change. We know it did change. The question is, where are we now as we're moving into summer vacation? How do we leverage these coming months so that we have enhanced preparation in the fall, whether the fall is back to school as close to normal as possible, back to school in split schedules, or back to school and suddenly we're into remote learning 2 weeks later, or we never actually go back and we continue remote learning. We can list out what the frameworks could possibly be for the fall, and we need to leverage this time to prepare for that. And so there are certain key action items that districts can be entertaining right now. And the first, of course, is intensive PD for the teachers, because the PD they've been getting right now is triage, but they need planful, long-range training and experience and practice and reflective conversations about what they've been doing during the shutdown, what's worked, what didn't work. We didn't have time before the shutdown to say, what have we been doing that we need to keep doing going forward? What have we been doing that we are no longer going to do going forward? So teachers were all figuring that out on their own the best they could. We need a planful approach to what that's going to look like, and then teachers need the learning to be able to put that in place. We have to engage in a curricular review, because teachers going into the fall with the same documents that they were using in the spring to inform their unit planning and their lesson planning is still going to be a recipe for frustration and a focus on extreme amounts of coverage with a lack of depth of learning when teachers are trying to work in this remote fashion. So it may be compression of curriculum or rethinking of curriculum. In talking with principals in one particular district, they're pretty pleased with the work that their math teachers have been able to do, leveraging online resources to keep their current model of their curriculum going, but they're finding very frustrating in their literacy instruction along reading and writing to do the same thing. The workshop model isn't translating for them, and they need the time and the resources to rethink that. There's going to be learning gaps. There's always learning gaps. There are going to be learning gaps where we don't expect them to be, and we're going to find some students who have learned beyond what we expected. But we need a way to diagnostically figure out where those are and how we're going to work with them or accommodate them. And that might also include a reconsideration of how we think about grouping students going forward. Talking again to principals in some districts where they're hearing from parents of special ed students, I want my child held back because they're not getting the instruction that I think they need, and well as students who are in the mainstream or on an honors track who are saying my child's just not prepared. And so there's parents who are asking for their children to be held back. There's children where the teacher may think that remediation is necessary. And so what does ninth grade look like again next year? It may not look the same as what it's looked like in the past, just as an example. We need to keep the UDL framework in mind as we go through all of this. So when we're talking about giving students multiple pathways for access, engagement, and expression of their learning, we need to think about what that looks like from a distance learning perspective, and be sure that as educators or as districts, we don't become overcommitted to one particular pathway because it's the most affordable or the easiest for our teachers to learn or the easiest for the parents to navigate, or whatever it happens to be. We still have to have those ranges of pathways for students when it comes to accessing the learning. And then we also need to be mindful of the equitability of our tech distribution, both connectivity, devices, software, all the things that Doug was referencing when he was talking about budgeting for this. And then finally, we need to start to think about the learning supports that we can provide to families. One of the initiatives that I've been undertaking since this started, and it's still at the starting line, I guess is the gentlest way to say it. I have worked with Fairfield University and Southern Connecticut State University and their education departments to identify pre-service teachers who did their student teaching in the fall or were about to or were engaged in their student teaching in the spring semester. So they've been through background checks, they can work with students and create a cadre of people who can provide remote tutoring and remote learning support to families where the parents are struggling to help the kids with the work. The districts need to provide a way for families to take advantage of those opportunities. We need a way to kind of build those pathways between families and the other resources around the schools that can continue to help the schools. It's about the collaboration and cooperation piece. So as Doug shared contact information, we have a couple of things to share from professional development services at CES. The first is that we have an app, which is pds@ces.glideapp.io. And in there, we index all of our webinars that we are offering for free. We also have another set of sessions that we host that we're calling office hours. So a webinar would have a particular agenda and a particular skill set that the participants are going to develop by participating. Open office hours have a theme, but then it's a Q&A with the people who attend. We also have a closed Facebook group, so people have to answer questions about who they are as an educator in Connecticut in order to join, and that is Educate SWCT, and the bit.ly/Educate SWCT. It is case sensitive, lets people join that Facebook group, and we are constantly sharing resources and answering questions as educators are posing them through that group. So that's becoming a good support network for people. And then we tweet regularly from professional development services at PDS-CES. So you can follow us there.
Thank you, Jackie.
Thank you, Chip.
I'm going to remember to unmute before I start, for once. I want to thank all of you. This was, I think, fascinating, depressing and uplifting at the same time. Depressing because we all know the resources that are going to be needed to do a lot of this work. Refreshing to know there are really good people that have a handle on what needs to be done. And if we can find them the resources, they're going to be able to do it. I want to open this up for questions or comments. If anybody wants to try to indicate, there was one question typed in on the chat. How will you ID learning gaps over the summer? And whether that's for Chip or Jackie. Did Jackie leave?
Jackie's here.
There she
I think she's smiling because I'm smiling too. That's the magic question, I think. The
Yeah.
the nature of trying to identify what the learning gaps are is going to be a challenge for everybody. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree, absolutely. Because right now we're still facing the challenge of how we assess what students are learning and how well they're learning in the ways that we're teaching right now. We haven't even answered the immediate question, let alone the question for the summer and the planning for next year. And I think that is one of those summer sessions where districts can kind of lean on RESCs to convene those conversations, and rather than having each district or even school try to figure that out for themselves, really bring groups of people together from the districts to start to make a plan for how the districts can move forward, empowering teachers to figure that out with who their students are.
Well, I imagine some of that would also be the teachers from this year talking to the teachers from next year and helping share that. There's so much that nobody's really going to know, or will find it harder to assess. So I could see that being a challenge.
I think it also goes along with that question about the curriculum and looking at what are the learning targets, what have the learning targets been for the 1920 school year, which ones do we know students have met up until, say, March 1st, and so what are the ones that were lingering from March to June? Which of those are really essential learning targets going forward? Which others may be kind of second tier targets? And now how do we assess for the ones where we say you cannot move from this class to that class, you cannot move from this grade to that grade without some measure of that?
Thank you. Other questions?
Well, a comment, Nick. I think that as Jackie may have mentioned early in her portion of the presentation, there is a process for curriculum compression, and that might be something for us as a state to investigate, to see if there's an opportunity to pull the most critical items out of curriculum for districts.
One thing I've taken away from today is that it looks like there's at least 3 primary areas that we have to really look at what we've done in the short term versus long term, thinking strategically rather than tactically. Obviously, the first and foremost is teaching. What will the impact be on teaching and learning? What resources do we have to ensure that this new reality is successful? We have to make sure everybody's connected, and that doesn't just mean a computer and a wire or wireless to connect it, but that they are filled with meaningful software, et cetera. Doug raised the issue of, we're getting these wonderful computers with a lot of software that we may not even want to use, or may find ourselves using until next year when the bill comes due. So there's that connectivity. I think the commission is going to have a role to play in that. We're going to have to be strong advocates for doing whatever we can to get the state to bring the connections, not just to the district border as they have in the past, but to look at how, especially those districts with a digital divide, how do we help support them better? And I think that's going to be part of our responsibility, but certainly districts are going to have to do it within their borders regardless. And then protection. I mean, the whole issue of, we've got this stuff, the protection of computers, digital safeguards are not free, at least not the good ones. And it was only a couple months ago, I was talking to a superintendent, when we were talking about protecting data, et cetera. He goes, how do I go to my board of ed and say, I'm going to have to cut a teacher to pay for a firewall? Or for that kind of protection. Well, you know what? If we're this dependent on this stuff, it's going to require more, not less. So I throw that out to you for feedback and maybe stimulate a little more conversation.
And on that point, your point, Nick, and also something that Chip mentioned earlier. So the commission has launched and been engaged in a campaign to support the creation and sharing of open resources. this is really, really important as we go into this season of two things going on. One is we've had an explosion of technology. And the other one is we're going to be having a really, really serious reckoning when it comes to local budgets. There's no, ifs, ands, or buts, given what's going on with the economy. This is the exact time that we should be looking at things like open education resources. We think about materials costs. We think about, as Chip said, collaborating across districts or regions through the RESCs, other groups to create common curriculum materials to share on those ongoing operational costs. If we're trusting our teachers to do amazing work in our classrooms, whether they're virtual or in person every single day, let's leverage those resources, the resources that they've developed to increase quality and save costs.
I have a question.
Yeah, Ken.
Ken Marcuccio from Derby. Our board, a concern of our board has been, the superintendent gives us, Dr. Conway gives us attendance and engagement each week, and there's sometimes a considerable gap between the kids that are actually online and how they're engaged. Has anybody done a study like this for the whole state of what like an average attendance and engagement number percentage should be? I don't know if anybody has done that yet. Like ours is from the elementary schools to the middle school to the high school is substantially different. And like our middle school has a high attendance, but a very low engagement. Like the attendance is in the 80% range, and actual engagement in the work is only 55%. So, I mean, I don't know, does anybody have any information on that?
I think you can look at, there's probably no one size fits all. So based on the factors that that you can measure, like you just mentioned, I think those are a starting point. Looking at attendance, even defining what attendance means in remote learning, and then taking it down to, I think, ultimately encouraging teachers to ask really simple questions like, how's this working for you? What are you struggling with? I mean, these are simple questions that can often shine a light. I was listening to higher education, but one professor is saying that he felt like he just did an amazing job with this class that he was teaching. Kids seemed to be, in the chat and responding, et cetera. But then when at the end of the lecture, when he said, so how's this working for you? How's remote learning? And like half the kids said, oh, I'm just totally distracted and I can't follow along. It's hard for me to track. I hear that from my own kids. So I think it's great to have sort of statewide dashboards and district-wide dashboards and metrics, and not to take anything away from that, but encouraging teachers to be asking those questions that they may not have, that they may not like the answers they're getting, but at least there's a level set of, who is engaged and what are those, those levels of challenge that they're encountering.
Yeah, Doug, to your point, a student who would have before this attended school and sat in a building from 7:30 in the morning until 2:10 in the afternoon isn't and shouldn't be sitting in front of a webcam from 7:30 in the morning until 2:10 in the afternoon. So what attendance means now is entirely different than what attendance meant then. And we're, I think, a bit more sensitive to the engagement piece now than we might have been back when we had the students sitting in our classroom and we would walk by and tap a desk and redirect a student and try and bring them back into a lesson, and that's really hard to do remotely. And so it's highlighting that pain point, I think, for teachers, the engagement piece. It was important then, it is still important now. We need new ways to think about how to measure or acknowledge when a student is engaged, because sitting and staring at their webcam is not engagement.
So Jackie, I would build on that. And one of the points that I had made earlier about not or resisting the temptation to replicate what we have. Teachers really didn't have any choice when we went out of school. And so to your point, Jackie, I think that people are realizing that that engagement comes in a very different form whether you're face-to-face or whether you are remote. And that's why I would encourage districts to, upon returning or as we prepare to return, investing in that engagement piece that would be independent of face-to-face or remote.
I have one other question. You were talking about the gap that's going to happen or is happening. What's going to happen in the fall if we go back and correlate this with the previous question I asked? You're going to have a much huger gap because it's important. They're missing, almost half of a school year. So some kids are going to be, obviously the better kids are doing their work anyway. The problem is for a teacher who's going to get another kid going from one subject level to another subject level, what's going to happen there? How are we going to handle that? I mean, I think we have to have, you have to start thinking about that now. How are we going to handle those kids who might not be well prepared for that advanced class that they're taking? I mean, does anybody have any ideas on that?
You mean remediation or?
Well, yeah, remediation for because of what happened, the kid is not quite advanced far enough to take the next advanced class that he's supposed to be taking,
Yeah.
or she.
And so while we didn't get towards a solution, I think that Jackie got towards clearly identifying the issue, which was reconsidering how we group kids. And right now, grade 1, grade 2, grade 3, grade 4, and I think that is a big move, but it has to be considered if we're going to address those gaps, because not only will kids have gaps, different kids will have different gaps, and that's going to be huge.
Yeah.
I think another thing that may have come out of this also, to Doug's point about remediation, is that we now have lots of different ways to think about how to help those students who do need learning support, who do have gaps, fill those gaps without it necessarily being something that gets wrapped into the classroom. If we do get to all be back in the same classroom and you do still have last year's second graders or this year's third graders, but you now have teachers who are going to be much more adept if we can really work with them this summer at implementing a blended learning model that then from a UDL point of view starts to meet those students where they are and help them fill those gaps on an individualized basis with a blended learning approach, so that the teachers in school instruction can proceed because the students are working on their own with the materials the teacher's curating for them to independently fill those gaps. It's going to be a brave new world.
Yeah.
So I have a couple of comments. I unfortunately can't get my video to work, which is too bad because I look amazing today. So just try to imagine that. A
Poor
couple
Karen.
of comments.
Hi, Karen.
Hi, everybody. A couple of comments. First of all, we have to, what we're trying to do is still teach in a traditional way, except in a non-traditional form. So people are just trying to transfer, that's what I've observed at least, trying to transfer their in-class teaching methods and assignments to an online environment. And perhaps we're seeing the edges of teaching in a different way, in holding school in a different way. Maybe we'll start to look at grouping kids differently than by grade, in fact, by needs as opposed to by grade, or something more non-traditional if this becomes prolonged. But I think that's a base problem, and I couldn't agree with you more. This is about good teaching. That's really what it's about. It's not about the technology. It's about still teaching well in a different way. And I'm trying to encourage people to think about class as something different. The one thing I felt that wasn't highlighted enough is the relationship piece of good teaching. And the more that I'm reading about this and researching this, the places it's working best, and within our district, I'm Hamden, that it's working best is when the teachers and other staff are making contact directly with kids. And kids are participating more when that's happening. They're more engaged, and that's part of good teaching. But I think it's such a big part of it that it needs to be recognized. Related to that, and I think probably many districts, are having problems deciding on the idea of video or not, and the invasion into privacy that causes. That if I am asked to turn on my video at home on my Chromebook that I've been lent by the school system, you may see that I'm poor. My classmates may see that I'm poor. You may see my teenage brother moon everybody in the class because he's a middle school jerk. That's what happens. You may hear my parents screaming at each other, or you may see me get smacked, or all sorts of DCF concerns that have been raised in my district. So we have a lot of people that are gun shy about using video, although there are certainly many very good reasons to do it. Isolation is a huge problem now for kids, and we know mental illness concerns are bigger and bigger and bigger. Yet the privacy issue keeps coming in, and I think having guidance at a state level would be incredibly valuable to a lot of districts. I have one last thing to say, and then everybody else, sorry, I apologize. I do see the content delivery, the content assets shared would be a great help, but I do see a difference between K6, maybe K8, and high school. The high school content and credit problem causes more concern for people than at the younger grades. And I know several states that are not New England states have statewide systems of courses that everybody can access, Virginia, Florida, for example. And if we were to allow something like that in Connecticut, and I know it's not easy because everybody's completely different. Everyone in Fairfield County has to have their own curriculum and courses, and because Westport and Darien are completely different than each other. It's difficult, but if we had something like they have in Virginia or Florida, that is statewide, at least for the secondary, where we're having to award credits, that would be an enormous asset.
I'm going to ask our panelists to maybe respond to that, and then we've gone over our time, and I see people are starting to drop off the attendance list. So I want to bring us back, but do any of the three presenters want to respond to Karen's comments?
I can make a quick comment. So, Karen, it is always a pleasure to have you joining any conversation because you always bring so much insight to it. The quick response is that the Commission is developing an open education resources portal. That's not, it would include courses as well as digital textbooks, et cetera, all open, license and free. That's underway. I would also say that there is an educational innovation fund, in addition to the CARES Act dollars, that our state can apply for, and that I'm working with the state education agency to encourage them to apply for, that would provide for structured online courses like Florida Virtual and Virginia and Wisconsin and what other states have developed. So that may be coming, but we would have to apply and receive funds to do that.
Well, I guess we're set then. I want to thank the presenters. Phenomenal job. I think we could start doing this weekly and you could bring up more topics, but maybe we can revisit this in a little while when we've had a little more time to process some of this, and some of the groups will be, some of those groups we've mentioned will be doing some of their work, hopefully not replicating each other's work. And we can come back closer to the fall and talk about where we are. Again, thank you all very much. And this will be recorded and available on our website shortly. So thanks, everybody. Have a good afternoon. Karen, I will call you right away.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Take care.
Bye.
Thanks,
Nick.
Chip. Thanks, Will Marie.
Bye-bye.